Great to see you, Tomas. How are you?
Very good. Nice to see you all.
I am so thrilled that you're joining me, and as important as anything, that you've spent time and effort to create a new book called Don't Be Yourself. And for me, when I saw it come through, I got a big smile because I'm like, okay, you're going to talk about something that's real. And it's something that, in my experience, has affected my life. And I really would like to understand, first and foremost, the inspiration for it. Why did you do it?
Yeah. It's a topic that has been bugging me for a while. I think, maybe 5 or 6 years. The book itself took 2 or 3 years to put together. A lot of research went into it. I guess I mostly get obsessed by topics where the popular or mainstream view has become so irrational that a data-driven perspective is controversial, or a rational perspective is controversial. So, the title, Don't Be Yourself, Why Authenticity is Overrated and What to Do Instead. The Don't Be Yourself part came from the publisher, from Harvard Business Review. I think, they have more experience with titles than myself and enjoy the kind of controversial, clickbaity aspect of it. But really, it's a book that attempts to inject much needed nuance to the debate on what it actually means to be authentic at work. And fundamentally, I'm trying to make the case, which you will find not controversial at all, that at some point, your right to be you ends and your obligation to others begins. That's all. So, I'm trying to kind of rethink authenticity in a way that is less self-centered and less narcissistic.
Well, let's just jump into it because the idea of being authentic, bringing your whole self to work, the power of vulnerability, Brene Brown, this has been well socialized over the past 20 years. And we've researched it in psychological safety, Amy Edmondson, who I know you partnered with recently. So, why are you coming at it in this way? Obviously, you mentioned HBR, supporting the idea, but where's the nuance? Why was it dangerous to bring your whole self to work?
Yeah, so, first, it's really interesting actually to acknowledge where this notion of authenticity or being true to thyself kind of originates, because you can go back to ancient Greece. Aristotle talked about it. I mean, in like Eastern cultures, the theme comes up. Obviously, Shakespeare and Hamlet. And then in kind of romanticism and philosophy, if you think about Jean-Paul Sartre, and then the industrial age, when Karl Marx warned against the kind of alienation of workers in what he saw as the dark side of capitalism, we've come a long way since then, creating cultures that are much more employee-centric. And, if you think about, I know you care a lot about employee engagement. If you think about the original definition of employee engagement by a guy called Kahn in 1990, he saw it as a beautiful definition as the degree of identification that you have with your work persona. So in essence, if you see your work self as an integral and critical part of your self-concept or your identity, you're going to be happy at work. And then there's also a chance that you're going to be more productive. Although, a lot of people are happy without being productive, and a lot of people are productive without being that happy. Now, if then we take the notion of being yourself too far, so far as to tell people that if they go to a job interview, they don't have to worry about what others think of them. They can just be, their unfiltered or uncensored self. Good luck getting a job, by the way, if that's the advice you follow. Or if you tell people that they can bring their whole self to work, which, by the way, would include grumpy you, impulsive you, opinionated you, and, indulging in broadcasting your unsolicited views about controversial topics with others to a point that you're obnoxious and annoying. I think there are limits to bringing your whole self to work or exposing others to every single dimension of your self-concept, when in fact, it is absolutely clear that we are rewarded for creating a version of ourselves that is more sanitized. We are not paid to unleash our real or unfiltered self on others. We're paid to display the best possible version of ourselves. And that doesn't mean being a fraud. You can exercise what I call strategic self-presentation to, come across as genuine and authentic, but while making an effort to please others and to basically be perceived in a positive way or positive vein by others.
I love where you're coming from so much. For me, as a long time mindfulness practitioner, what I'm hearing is this is setting boundaries and
Mhm.
really having clear intention and having an appropriate response to achieve that intention. So the question embedded within this is how do you identify in what way do you show up? How do you identify what that looks day to day?
Yeah, and this is, it's difficult not to kind of refer to the academic research here because, we can all have opinions about authenticity and what it means to be you. It's actually very much in line with sort of the narcissistic version of authenticity. Well, that's how I define it. So, it's my truth. But then we can never have a discussion, right? There is a lot of systematic research in this area. And I know, Al, you care about data and evidence, which is super interesting because the point of defining something is that you can then measure it, right? And if you can't measure something empirically or get data or break it down into observable indicators or data points, it's just metaphysics, it's philosophy. Now, in the workplace, as organizational scientists and psychologists, we'd care about defining things properly, measuring them in a way that predicts something valuable or useful. And all decades of scientific research show that there are only two ways to measure how authentic somebody is. One is you ask themselves on a 1 to 10 point scale, how authentic are you in general, or how authentic were you when you did that? Now, this won't surprise you, right? If you ask 1,000 people how authentic they are on a 1 to 10 point scale, the average will be like 9.5. Absolutely everybody sees themselves as authentic, just like everybody sees themselves as funny, creative, and a good person, including some of the worst human beings in history. And then the other approach is okay, so first, still, when you ask people to report how authentic they feel, not in general, but in a specific situation, the research is also very interesting here. When you do something that, leads to success or that elevates your status or that is appreciated by others, you then interpret that as your authentic self. Whereas if you screw up or you do something that leads to failure or that wasn't my real self, I was forced to do it. So in other words, we rationalize our behaviors and interpret good things as our authentic self and bad things as acting out of characters. And what that means is that authenticity is a self-enhancing strategy that we use. And then there's the other approach, which is much more important. What matters really is not how authentic you feel or you think you are, but how authentic other people think you are. Why? Because that's how you build trust as a leader. You mentioned psychological safety. Absolutely. If other people trust you, you can build safety in your team, and then that leads to positive outcomes, innovation, performance, productivity, etc. Even the kind of balance or moderate approach to vulnerability, not breaking down in tears all the time or kind of being the center of attention and being needy and wanting a hug every single time you get to work, but actually strategically opening up so that you encourage your followers to be mature enough and to understand that you're not a superstar or a superhero, you're a leader or somebody in charge. Well, how authentic other people think you are, so authenticity as an attribution, is very important. It predicts objective success. But again, the research finds that people find you authentic when A, they like you, when B, they agree with your political views, beliefs, or your values, or C, when you actually have high levels of emotional intelligence, which means you engage in skilled self-presentation and you know how to engage in self-control and how to limit what you communicate. In other words, you're a strategic self-presentational person, or you have political skills. In other words, you engage in successful impression management. When you call it impression management, it sounds really bad. When we call it EQ, we love it. But in essence, high EQ leads to other people seeing you as authentic, even though what it means, you're probably a method actor that has become really comfortable with his or her professional self. Ask the question, is Obama authentic? Is Trump authentic? We have no way of knowing, objectively speaking, whether they are. You can ask them, but we shouldn't trust them. And if we find them authentic, that's probably a reflection of whether we align with their political views, whether we like them, and whether they do things that we find valuable from a self-centered or egotistical point of view. So you can see how difficult it is to quantify this in objective way. In fact, maybe Elon Musk will give us Neuralink and we'll have a brain AI interface to see what you really think about something. But, Freud tried to get there and it's not a good idea. It's opening a can of worms.
Yeah, definitely. All kinds of hard no on that. As you're sharing this, some words are coming to mind: adaptability, agility, improv, situational intelligence, things that might not have been valued as much historically. Would you be fair to say that this skill set, number one, can be learned and practiced over time, but it takes the right language and the right mental model to approach it?
Yeah, absolutely. I was speaking to, you might know Anne Sugar. She writes a column for Forbes and she does a lot of executive coaching. And, we're talking about the book earlier today. And she told me, I have an executive that I coach and he tells me, I don't want to change. This is my way. I don't want to adapt to others. They have to adapt to me. What would you say to that? It's like, well, it's like a fundamental feature of a self-centered, narcissistic executive, right? The world should evolve around them. I mean, granted, sometimes if you're really powerful and very rich, you can afford that, right? As I note in the book, Authenticity, which has been, co-opted or utilized as a tool to increase diversity and inclusion when those programs existed before they were demolished, by so many organizations. But well intendedly, it had been utilized as a kind of a sort of the narrative of the story was, let's help outgroup individuals not feel repressed and feel safe to express hidden or ostracized or condemned aspects of their identity. But the irony is that authenticity is a privilege for the elite. If you have a lot of power, you can indulge, right? Let's look at Elon Musk as an example. He has his own social media platform. He is the richest man in the world, minus, 1 week or two. So he can do whatever he wants. Not a very good role model to copy, right? But it's important to see kind of that. You mentioned situational awareness and adaptability is so important. There is no virtue or no kind of a really strength to somebody not wanting to flex at all when they go from one situation to the other and having the behavioral and psychological rigidity that makes them act in the same way all the time. That isn't a bastion of like authenticity, or it's not a moral quality. It shows poor social skills. It's basically, by definition, what somebody who isn't aware of the situation or doesn't care about the situation at all, so they're either on the spectrum or they're a psychopath or have psychopathic tendencies, would show. And I give you a concept that I think you love. Decades of psychological research have shown that one of the most important parts of our self-concept, our identity, is this notion of self-complexity. Who you are comprises multiple dimensions. There's the you who is the podcaster, the you who is the consultant, the you who is the businessman, the you who is the father, the spouse, the son, etc. Work or any other situation isn't an invitation to display or express each and one of these dimensions. It's an invitation to express and display relevant elements of our self-concept. So, just because you are bringing to work one or two aspects of your dimension doesn't mean you should quit, doesn't mean you should despair and find another job. I mean, unless your definition of a career is joining a cult, you should be comfortable working somewhere where some elements of yourself are met, expressed, fulfilled by other people's values, and some are not. And then, life is full of other areas or situations where you can express them. I know it sounds like common sense, but it has become so uncommon that it's controversial to say, look, I don't bring my whole self to work. I bring my professional self, and there's more to life than work.
Help me think through this, because I had an interaction. It was about 2 years ago. It was with a very prominent business leader, and I shared something personal with that individual. And after I got off the call, I felt sad. I felt dirty. I felt like I did something wrong. to put it in more simple language, I felt like I overshared. And that, I don't want to say that's a wedge between us, but it was something that I'm like, no, I wasn't wrong. I was being honest. I was being vulnerable. I was being my, authentic self. But what you're sharing actually puts it in a different context where I probably did say too much. I didn't set a proper boundary. I wasn't playing the role that he saw me being in that moment. Now, can you help me process that even a couple years later? Could it be that in certain times, not only in that example, but some of us might have a propensity to overshare and kind of lose the context of why we're having an interaction with somebody?
If humanity didn't have that propensity, there will be no social media, right? I mean, it's clearly there are billions of people oversharing and engaging in inappropriate self-disclosure on a daily basis. Some of them, I mean, I would say outside social media, in the real world or in one-on-one interactions, it's really valuable to have the capacity to internalize the feedback from others. By the way, Al, is no different from I feel comfortable in my team as a team member or as a leader to crack a joke, right? Now, what if that joke is offensive to somebody? What if it upsets somebody? Well, in that case, I'm probably better off realizing that and feeling bad so that I apologize and I do that again, right? So, no different in the example that you gave. Reputation isn't imposed on others, it's negotiated through the interactions you have with others. In any interaction, you are trying to get others to perceive you in the way you want to perceive yourself. You're trying to kind of sell your aspirational self to others, but at some point others give you feedback and it might be, whoa, 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 you're oversharing and you're making me uncomfortable because you overstep the boundaries. And I think the beauty of it is that we can engage in these self-conscious emotions, and this can stay with us even for years, because fundamentally what you learn about yourself is that there is going outside your comfort zone, but there is also regretting going outside your comfort zone in certain elements. I think your reaction shows emotional maturity. Somebody who said, well, whatever, I don't care about the other person, it shows a lack of emotional maturity or infantile interaction with others.
Well, I'm gonna take that compliment and run with it
Yeah,
today, so
exactly.
thank
There you
you for
go.
that. Because I remember I was influenced, like, being courageous, power of vulnerability, to reference, Brené Brown's work, again, which I believe has a lot of goodness in it, but it also could set a trap, which arguably I walked into on that particular day with that particular interview, or that, not interview, but that situation and with that person. So, and I know you, in the book, you talk about, these 4 traps. Can you speak to those traps and how to potentially avoid them?
Yeah, so the four traps are kind of the typical mainstream or the most famous, if you like, mantras that underpin the mainstream kind of notion of authenticity. Um, I call them traps because even though they are presented as well-meaning self-help advice designed to make us more effective, actually they're very, very difficult to follow. And if you did manage to follow, or even if you tried to follow them, it creates more problems than it actually solves. So the first is this notion that you should always be honest, not just with others, but also with yourself. It's interesting to think about both sides, right? I mean, can you even be honest with others if you're not honest with yourself? Probably not. I have a young son and I asked him over the weekend, did you finish the, jam jar? And he said, no, I didn't. And I actually think he probably truly thought he didn't, but I know he did, right? So he wasn't lying to me, he was lying to himself. Actually, adults are a lot like a 5-year-old. We lie to ourselves all the time because it is a successful strategy for deceiving others. If you go to an interview thinking you're the hottest thing since sliced bread and you're amazing, even though that's not true, you're more likely to get that interview than if you say, look, In reality, I have no idea about this job, but I will try to work it out and learn it. So please hire me, even though I'm not very well qualified. So, self honesty is very rare, and delusions and self deception actually lead to success in interpersonal interactions. And then there's the other part, right? Like there are many, many instances. Even Ray Dalio, one of the champions of radical candor, will tell you, look, we love radical transparency, but if somebody just came back from maternity or paternity leave and showed you a picture of the newborn baby and they told you, isn't my baby cute? You wouldn't say, no, they're very ugly, right? Because social skills also mean showing empathy and caring for others. So that's the first one. Second trap is don't worry about what people think of you. Well, actually, unless you're a narcissist, a psychopath, or on the spectrum, worrying and paying attention to what people think of you is a fundamental way to get better, to evolve, to improve, and to display social skills. There is an advantage in knowing how your behavior impacts others. And that doesn't mean that you should engage or you will engage in Machiavellian strategies of manipulation. I mean, it's a fundamental ingredient of social skills and interpersonal effectiveness. Third trap, which I love, is always be true to your values. Follow your heart no matter what. Sounds great, right? Well, what if your values are crooked? I mean, if you're Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi, Stalin, Lenin, Hitler, Mao, should you be true to your values? Most of the damage that we have seen caused to the world, not due to natural disasters, but due to human-induced pain, weren't people who failed to follow their values. They were people with crooked, destructive, and toxic values who were really, really good at following them. And by the way, they met most of the traditional definitions of authenticity, like consistency between what they say and what they do. Unfortunately, what they did was horrific, right? And so on a more minor level, the world is already very tribalized and polarized because we have lost the ability to question our own values. I don't know if you do this, Al, but I spend a lot of time listening to podcasters and broadcasters and media journalists that I don't agree with. It's quite masochistic, not very cathartic, but it helps me understand the other perspective on things, and it helps me often understand that my values are not right or are questionable on certain issues. And then the final one is bring your whole self to work. As I always say, my whole self isn't even welcome at home. People at home are still waiting that I take certain aspects of my whole self somewhere else, preferably not to work, but, your whole self includes undesirable tendencies that even your best friends aren't capable of enjoying for the whole duration of the vacation or the Christmas lunch. What I try to do in the book is to present an alternative to this that leads to higher levels of career success, more leadership effectiveness, and actually more diverse and inclusive organizations, which is helping people understand that more often than not, they're better off trying not to be their past or present self, to sculpt or curate a future version of themselves that is better, that is more aspirational, and that actually even includes the ability to do things they haven't done before, because that makes them better and improves their reputation.
So good. There's so many things come to mind because as you know, I've worked with students, early career professionals, and those in career transition, in addition to business leaders. And it's inviting the question for me, at what point does someone in their life journey learn this and practice this? I mean, I see it being so valuable for young people as well as established and emerging leaders. So can you speak to that? I mean, you're raising, young
Yeah.
kids.
And you
How
have
does
kids as well, right? You have kids
Yeah,
as well.
they're older now, 24 and 22, but,
Okay. But
they're still growing and
I
figuring
would
out
guess
how.
that at some point they were very young. They realized that, they have to behave better when they're invited into other people's homes than in your own home, right? At what age? 3, 4, 5? Well, let's not lose that ability as grown-ups. Whatever happened to smiling to your boss and bitching about them when you get home? It worked for ages. So let's keep it that way. A fundamental feature or hallmark of psychological maturity is to understand that it's advantageous to kind of decouple the stimulus response chain. That even if somebody says something that annoys you, it's advantageous to count up to 10. Even if you don't do mindfulness and you're not kind of a Buddhist monk, you will understand that a lot of the times when we act based on impulse and we follow our gut feel, it leads to regrettable experiences, right? So I think self-control is a beautiful trait, and we seem to have kind of a lost sense of that. It never features very highly in conversations about leadership success. We talk about integrity, and what's integrity but the ability to resist temptation, the ability to resist under, like, basically succumbing to short-term influences that might be good for you as an individual in a selfish, short-term kind of sense, but might harm the group and the system of which you're part. So fundamentally, I think that's one of the healthy, rational antidotes to this. Just be you. They will adjust. Don't worry about people think of you. If you think you're great, you are. Go, girl, or hey, just do it. Believe in yourself. Well, all of those things I think started in a well-intended or well-meaning way, but they're too easily distorted and exacerbated to the point that what we preach is this radical and antisocial version of individualism. It's like when people say, well, that is how I see it, and therefore we won't have a discussion or a conversation, or that's my truth. So, we're done with it. If we lose the ability to collaborate, to see things from somebody else's perspective, and again, to understand when the right to be ourselves ends and our obligation to others begins, it's very difficult to have a highly functioning society, let alone a healthy work culture.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And this actually makes me reflect on something that I've been putting forth for 20 or so years now, based on where I was at that time. However, I sense that it has been a healthy construct. So I have been pressed around leadership competencies over the years, like I'm sure you have been heavily involved. And how do I prioritize them? How do I create learning experiences? How do I assess for them? This certainly echoes and was validated because it came later by Carol Dweck's work around growth mindset, and I used the term compassionate curiosity. So where I'll land with this is that when asked the number one leadership competency for me, my answer has been the willingness and capacity to learn and in turn take action on that learning. And I'm not necessarily asking for validation of that. What I am asking about particularly is that willingness part as well as the capacity. Because, yeah, we might have the ability, but we need to have the willingness to show up differently, to show up appropriately, and learn what's called for in that particular instance. Does this align with what you just shared?
Yeah, so in the book, I talk about the importance of curiosity, and so there's a lot of growth mindset there, because you need to have, at least on the intellectual level, an aspiration to change and get better. But I think the most difficult part of that, because everybody loves change until they have to do it themselves, and even then, what people love is to have changed, not to undergo the painful process of change. I always say, work New Year's resolutions are broken within the first 2 months, and that's something that people truly want to change. It's not change imposed by a manager, by a coach. It's things that you truly want to do, and yet after 2 months it's broken, and then you recycle it year after year. So everybody loves change until they have to do it themselves. I think the most difficult part is to have the intellectual humility and self-criticism to entertain the idea that maybe we are wrong and other people are right. As I always quote this research, something like 95% of people describe themselves as open-minded. And what they have in common is that they all hang out with people who are exactly like themselves. They can't even expose themselves to. So I think that's the part that is really, really uh, tricky. When I talk about the importance of sort of like not being yourself in leadership, I think fundamentally, with leaders, the main question is, can people change? Yes, but mostly they don't. Also, when people change, leaders are no exception. They tend to change in two ways, which are not very beneficial. We either become a more boring version of our earlier selves, which is called psychological maturity. So in other words, you become more agreeable, more prosocial, less neurotic, kind of more empathetic or more tolerant. That's the best case scenario. The other one is you become a more exaggerated version of your early selves, which you can see how, even good things are bad when taken too far. It is also true that changeability, and if you like, growth mindset or coachability, is actually a part of leadership potential, which creates this incredible paradox, right? Which is that basically coaching works the best or works best with those who need it the least. If I'm coaching you and you are open-minded, curious, not defensive when I'm giving you critical, constructive feedback, and you're eager to change and you have growth mindset, you probably didn't really need that much coaching. You would have improved by yourself. Think about somebody at the other end of the spectrum. Whatever you say about Trump and Musk, they might be geniuses and amazingly successful, but let's agree, they're not that coachable, right? They don't change very much. It's not controversial to say that. So, you know, so coaching works best with those who need it the least. And I think my advice in general for leaders is that it's a very underrated but important quality to learn and master, to learn to go against your nature. Because we're all trapped or constrained by our own personality or preferred predispositions and adaptations. It's easy. It's like playing to your strengths. It sounds great because it's the easiest thing to do. But if you can learn to go against that, you learn new adaptations. That's when you can say, look, simple examples, but it will resonate with people. I used to have terrible fear and phobia of public speaking, and I hated it. But I trained myself, I practiced, I put myself in a situation. I still don't enjoy it, but now I can do it. And then if you do it, people say, I don't believe that you were ever afraid of it. That's because you learn to go against your nature. Same for a leader who is comfortable being the center of attention and mansplaining and suddenly learns to shut up and listen. Each and one of these examples are examples of inauthentic behavior, if you like, because you're not letting your past and present self limit your future self. You're learning to not just be yourself, but to be somebody better. And that's the aspiration that I'm trying to kind of, if you like, preach about in my book. That's the positive side. Bringing down kind of a narcissistic authenticity is the negative and the critical part, but there is a positive kind of and practical recommendations for leaders and employees.
It's such a wonderful distinction and very sticky example, and it actually explains my journey quite clearly as well, because I had a similar, I wouldn't go so far as call it phobia, but it's like it's not a natural thing to do. You don't just wake up and you have hundreds and thousands of people in front of you. So yeah, it is a learned behavior. I have a few more questions, and if you're listening, watching, and you have a question, by all means, ask it here on LinkedIn, and we'll get to as many as we can, or do some follow-ups. I want to pick up on something that you shared earlier around being wrong. And in the social sciences and life, I find very few things being truly binary, right and wrong. There's different ways of showing up, different ways of doing things. So, in terms of how we express ourselves, realizing that limitation, and also when we hear other people's perspectives and ideas, ensuring that that's just that a perspective or idea doesn't mean that we were quote unquote wrong. Can you speak to again how we process other people's perspectives and ideas?
Yeah, so obviously I agree with you, and a few things come to mind. I mean, I'm still a scientist at heart and an academic by training. So, one of the most beautiful quotes that I remember from PhD student was examining their thesis, and the dedication and acknowledgments they quoted hasn't been attributed to anybody specific or is misattributed, but there's this wonderful quote about the goal of science being finding better ways of being wrong, which is beautiful, right? Because you're probably always going to be somewhat wrong, and perfection or ultimate truth is unattainable, but you can find better ways of being wrong, or you can be less wrong about things. And that's a beautiful thing about science. The other one is that, science is the belief in the ignorance of experts. Just because you are paid a lot or you're famous or you have titles, doesn't mean I have to believe you. There is a methodology for testing the, the kind of believability or trustworthiness of what you're saying. But then there's the reality of life. And I think, at some point I thought of writing a book about radical moderation or the need to kind of re-embrace nuance. But then I thought, if I'm right, then nobody will read it, because the argument is that as the world becomes more complex, we become lazier and lazier and try to find simpler and simpler heuristics about things, right? So I'm going to use a very trivial example, but even the world of podcasting, there are millions of new shows and podcasts out there. Imagine if you had to listen to all of them to decide whether you agree with somebody or not. And it's a lot easier to say, okay, this friend likes us, so therefore it's, to the right, and I won't listen to it. This friend like this, it's to the left, so therefore, like the need to make radical, overly simplistic, and probably wrong categorical classifications of everything. It's a coping strategy that we leverage or use in a world that is becoming more and more complex. Same, by the way, every time there is a democratic political election. Imagine, like, if we had to sit down and think about the track record of candidates and the nominations, it's a lot easier to watch them debate and say, oh, I like this person. I would rather go out for a beer with this and not that. And, so we cling to these primordial hunter-gatherer instincts. In the old days, it was easy to decide whether we trust somebody or not because you hang out with 20 people all your life and it was easy to judge competence. Now, you almost need to have a PhD on everything to spend 5 or 7 years making up your rational might. And then there is AI to tell us something, but AI is increasingly optimized to tell us what we want to hear and what we want to read. So you can see how, in essence, you're right, Al, but the sad thing is that our desire to basically be right or feel smart eclipses our interest in understanding the world as it really is. And that is maybe, that is the most kind of worrying or concerning part about us as a species. We're so smart that we invented AI. Wow, amazing. We can even now outsource slow thinking to a machine and not do any thinking at all, which of course is worrying. But then that machine will be fine-tuned or optimized to tell us what we want to hear and what we want to see. It doesn't bode
Well,
well, but that's why we need to fight, and we need to kind of, even if nobody pays attention, we need to kind of highlight the nuance underlying thing. I think actually Adam Grant is doing such a wonderful thing about that, because even though he has this incredible following and he's a superstar and he's so prolific and a best-selling author and has millions of people, he always still tries to show both sides of things and nuances. And it's really, really hard to get attention or keep people's attention by being nuanced. But we need to try, because otherwise we're just, kind of throwing gasoline to the fire.
yeah, thank you for calling that out because, yes, our brains want simplicity, yet we live in a complex world. And the idea that we need the patience and grit to actually understand complex topics like running an organization. And I have spent some time recently and I wrote an article about why I am working to debunk myths, the stories that we're telling ourselves, calling some of these out and providing evidence, and that to the contrary. And not to say that it's to another right, but we do have these stories that we're reinforcing. And to your point, AI oftentimes reinforces this narrative. So my question, and again, I have a couple more after this. I have long cited this Chinese proverb: the beginning of wisdom is calling things by their right names. So the language that we're using, whether it be authenticity, vulnerability, oftentimes they're ill-defined, not only by others in alignment, but by, ourselves. So what you have given me and other readers of your book the gift is to define authenticity
Yes.
in a real, actionable, appropriate way to serve as an asset, as opposed to fall into, one of these. So my question to you, number one, does that align with kind of your purpose for writing the book? And number 2, can you talk to the power of words and the language that we
Yeah.
use and tell ourselves?
And you're making, I don't say this in the book, but you're asking such an interesting and deep question that you're actually, helping me understand that, fundamentally, I think what I'm trying to do is to say, let's spend less time worrying about whether somebody is authentic and whether we are authentic, and especially less time trying to work out what people really think deep down or who they are deep down, because you'll never get there. Freud said you need 15 years of therapy and you might realize that you're either neurotic and then you understand there is no meaning, or you're psychotic and then you should be institutionalized, right? So, I mean, those are still and more time really deciding whether we can trust somebody or not. So fundamentally, I want to replace all the discussion around authenticity for a discussion around integrity, which is more important. And integrity is critical because it's the main reputational currency that we use to decide whether somebody should be trusted or not. And of course, when you make mistakes, they're costly. And when, Warren Buffett famously said it takes 20 years to harness a positive reputation and 1 minute to lose it. Absolutely right. But the fundamental advantage that we have in human interactions and in civilization is that we don't need to know the whole self of somebody or what they think deep down on every single issue to decide whether they can be trusted or not. All we need to do is to focus on how they behave and how they treat others, and that's enough. And likewise, if you're seeing that from the point of view of the actor, don't worry so much about telling people what you really think or what you really feel. Just behave in a way that makes you a trustworthy, good corporate citizen. And by the way, in order to do that, you're going to have the ability to not tell them everything you say, you think, everything you feel, and to keep certain aspects of your self concept away from work. So I think integrity is as Yuval Harari says, the two fundamental kind of strengths or superpowers of Homo sapiens are storytelling and our ability to collaborate. Both go hand in hand. For you to be good at collaborating with others and useful to others, you need to tell them a story about yourself, but others will choose to believe you or not based on how you behave. Otherwise, if we believe, maybe the biggest example of this is like when somebody tells you they're authentic, it's a bit like when a restaurant tells you it's an authentic Mexican, authentic Chinese, authentic Taiwanese. You probably can assume if it has authentic there, it probably isn't authentic. And people are the same, let's just stop falling or paying attention to those who tell us they are an authentic leader, an authentic person, and pay more attention to how people behave. My hypothesis is that, or my assumption is that the most trustworthy people with the highest integrity, they're not going around telling you, I'm so authentic. They let their actions speak.
Love it, love it. And so I see some questions coming in. I'm gonna get to those as a follow-up because we're coming up on time, and I wanna ask one more, potentially, quote, unquote, "big question." And it's around this. You mentioned feedback earlier, and when, let's say, a manager gives feedback to somebody else, they often come from a knowing place. They make a host of assumptions that they might be aware of or unaware of, and then on the other side, I see people, because they're in a hierarchical situation, feel that they have to, quote unquote, take the feedback without having been heard. And
Yeah.
truly, they know that manager just doesn't understand and they're not curious about the situation that led them to, a decision. So I want to frame this a bit more. So I had the privilege of being at UT Austin earlier this year. Brene Brown was being interviewed by Ethan Harris at UT Austin Business School, and they were talking a lot about feedback. And I was trying to behave. I was in the back of the room, and Brene Brown shared that we have to move past the Welshian definition of leadership. You know, working out the bottom 10%. And so, me being me, I got up during the Q&A and asked, well, if we're going to move past the Welshian definition of leadership, should we be moving past the McKinsey-esque definition of feedback? Because there's research that shows it disengages not only the person being given the feedback, the provider of the feedback themselves.
Yeah.
And it also is the case where it's not trained, it's not coached, it's not so what I put forth is that rather than give feedback, let's talk about something different. I advocated OQIs, observations, questions, and ideas, on the
Yeah.
premise that we as human beings need to be seen, heard, and empowered. We don't want to be invisible. We don't want to be ignored. And oftentimes we don't want to be told what to do, particularly
Yeah.
when we're not understood. So I know I shared a lot there, but I
Yeah.
just want to get your, in relation to, why not be authentic and showing up as the smart person, is it worthwhile to redefine, use different language of how we show up and collaborate with others, whether it be in a hierarchical situation or with peers or otherwise? Your thoughts?
So look, I think there's a lot to unpack there, and I know we are kind of almost on time, but I think, the problem with feedback is that most of it is rubbish. And so, I'm less bothered about kind of what strategy approach or formal kind of process you want to opt for, and really more interested in kind of the expertise of the source, the intention of the source, and of course the social skills to it. So it's a cliche to say feedback is a gift, right? That's like saying our company is like a family. It might be a dysfunctional, like most families, or like, and feedback is a gift, like like that ugly, itchy sweater that your aunt gifted you for your birthday, and you have to wear because it's uncomfortable. We need to train people to be better at providing feedback, and we need to train people to be better at receiving feedback as well. In the book, I quote a segment of another book that came out recently called Infantilized: How the Workplace Killed Adulthood, which starts with an anecdote of a young employee who was having her performance review, and the manager says, you did really great, you hit your target, you're very productive, you exceeded your performance here and here and here. But if I have one opportunity for improvement or one kind of constructive critical feedback, it's this: it'll be good if you pay a little bit more attention to your spelling in emails, because particularly when you're communicating to clients and key stakeholders, it's a little bit sloppy and there are mistakes. And you say, what do you mean? Like, for example, what? And then the manager says, well, these are examples of words that, and her answer is, but this is how I spell it. And then goes home and her parents call the manager and say, how dare you tell our daughter, So I think, when people talk about the importance of grit and resilience and really being a highly functioning, mature adult in a workplace, what we mean is that is like probably your biggest opportunities or your biggest kind of I would say, raw ingredients that can help you improve and evolve are going to come from fairly uncomfortable interactions. And by the way, the people, especially because we're interested in building cultures that are more and more pro-social and more employee-centric and nicer, and we evolved, right? The workplaces now look a little bit like adult amusement parks, or, kind of, they have all these features. It goes overboard when we basically lose the ability to tell others, hey, Al, you sucked in this presentation. But of course, I'm telling you this because I want you to improve and actually. So you have to find the tools and the way to do it. And there has to be an intent. So all this is to say that it's probably safe to ignore 80% of the feedback that is out there, especially the one that is positive and reinforcing your ego and not authentic. But at the same time, the 20% that might make you uncomfortable and might highlight a gap between who you think you are and who you want to be, you should treasure it. That is the gift, the ugly sweater that you don't like to wear, but actually it can make you a better person.
Yeah, and it's also the case where I'll just add, if I may, as we start to wrap up here, is that when somebody gives you that feedback, that sample size of one, and you as a scientist know, you know, get more data, get more perspectives that can help inform.
Well, let me just finish on this. One executive that I was coaching once told me, he literally asked this question. I said, you speak really highly about 360-degree feedback, multi-source feedback, and I see that you really like them. And he said, personally, I had really bad experiences with them. So can you give me another tool for getting to know myself? If you had bad experiences, what do you think that means?
Yeah,
If absolutely everybody tells you that you don't listen, that you are impulsive, and that you're grumpy and irritable and unpredictable, there might be something there. I quote the great David Bowie in the book when he said, I am only the person the greatest number of people think I am. Because our reputation is fragmented and dispersed. It's sort of like scattered around all the people who know you. And if you really want to know who you truly are, you have to get them all together and get to exchange stories. That usually happens at your funeral, luckily so, because until then, you don't want them to exchange stories. Some, yes, but not others.
I couldn't agree more. Hey, Tomas, I think you have your book in reach.
Yes.
Do you? Can you
There
show
we
it?
are. Yeah.
Well, again, thank you for sharing. Thank you for writing the book. Thank you for being your awesome self. And thank you for staying on a bit longer than we had originally
Yeah. And
planned.
I'll make sure you get a copy so it will look great behind you since you have the previous two there as well. So I'll
That's
make sure you get it. Thank you
right.
so much for the invitation, my friend.
Of course, my friend. You be well. Thank you.